What have we got a warrant out?
You've got an outstanding immigration warrant. We'll talk about it in the vehicle. Okay?
Got an outstanding what?
Yep, outstanding immigration warrant. We'll talk about a vehicle, okay?
Absolutely insane.
So Piers is a coward. If I went on with him, like when I went on with him last time, he can't win the argument or the...
Can you get me a solicitor?
Just turn off your live feed, please.
Yeah?
Do you understand what I just said?
No, can you explain it again?
First suspicion causing a breach of the peace.
What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean, officer?
One question, something which you may
What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean?
I've been told that some of the fees that you're doing in the case,
Not at all, I've never said that.
George, that's the information I've got.
I'm inciting people.
Can you not
I'm
just go
inciting
back through
people.
his video and
How have I
and watch
incited
it? He
people?
hasn't.
This is free speech. This is where we're at. You're not even allowed to. Look at this.
Look how many people...
Man, what you try and hide? Do you know when you do this? More people.
The only sharp things are lights, isn't it? Just let them do this.
Why are they coming in like that? Surely that's wrong. Why would you, I wouldn't skip on a boat and go to another country and hop off and expect to be well looked after. But apart from that, this is just United Kingdom.
Just to stand up for what I believe in. Yeah. We lose an identity of our country and somebody needs to stand up and fight for it.
People may have had different reasons, but they came for the same person. At the centre of it all, the anti-Islam activist Tommy Robinson.
Keir Starmer is responsible for the sort of shit that happens there. Because he's put a target on every one of us with his smears and lies for telling the truth. Charlie Kirk told the truth. If Charlie Kirk lived in the UK, Keir Starmer would lock him up. How dare you make comments about his death? When you're responsible for this shit, people with your mindset, condemning people, putting targets on them, lying about them, and then pretending you give a shit. Absolute fucking hypocrisy.
This is the crux of Robinson's attack. By eliminating the space for peaceful conservative activism, governments like Starmer's create the very conditions that lead to extremism and violence. He's saying the system builds the pressure cooker and then acts surprised when it explodes. That's why his words resonate far beyond Britain's borders. They're touching on a global issue about what happens when governments decide which political voices are acceptable and which must be destroyed. Charlie Kirk's assassination, in Robinson's telling, is not an isolated tragedy. It's the inevitable outcome of a political climate that demonises and criminalises one side of the spectrum. And here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Robinson is warning that Starmer's government hasn't just silenced Conservatives in Britain. It's exporting the model across the Western world. Look at the coordinated policies on hate speech, online censorship, ship it, and the weaponisation of disinformation laws. These aren't just national issues anymore. They're becoming global frameworks. Robinson is arguing that what happened to Kirk in America and what happens to activists in Britain is part of the same pattern. An establishment determined to crush dissent at any cost. And that, he says, is why Charlie Kirk was such a threat, because he proved that you can build a mass conservative movement without resorting to extremism, and that terrifies the political elite. The reaction to Robinson's comments has been swift and divisive. Supporters say he's finally telling the truth that no mainstream politician will dare admit, that censorship breeds violence and hypocrisy fuels hatred. Critics accuse him of exploiting a tragedy for his own political agenda, but whatever you think of Robinson, one thing is undeniable. His attack on Starmer has turned a tragic American assassination into a political war that now stretches across 2 continents. The debate is no longer just about who killed Charlie Kirk. It's about whether Western governments are creating the conditions for political assassinations through their own policies. And this is just the beginning, because Robinson isn't backing down and Starmer isn't staying silent. The clash between these 2 men, one the Prime Minister of Britain, the other the outlaw of Britain, has only just begun. And the stakes could not be higher. Tommy Robinson's blistering attack on Keir Starmer didn't fade after the first outburst. It ignited. Within hours of his statement, clips of Robinson's words spread across social media platforms, drawing millions of views. Hashtags like hashtag Starmer hypocrisy and hashtag justice for Charlie began trending not just in Britain, but in the United States as well. What had started as a tragic American assassination was now morphing into an international showdown over free speech, censorship, and government power. Robinson doubled down with a follow-up video, this time laying out his arguments step by step in a way that even his critics couldn't ignore. He wasn't just angry, he was methodical, and that's what made his attack even more dangerous for Starmer. In this second statement, Robinson laid bare what he called Britain's two-tier justice system. He pointed to recent arrests of ordinary citizens for so-called hate speech online, arrests not for threats or incitement, but for criticising immigration policies or mocking government officials. He contrasted this with the treatment of establishment-aligned activists who, in his words, get a free pass. He reminded viewers of the fact that political figures and activists aligned with the left have been allowed to make inflammatory comments with little to no consequence, while conservatives face immediate police action for far less. This is not about law and order, Robinson declared. This is about control. It's about silencing one side of the debate while protecting the other. And here's where Robinson connected the dots back to Charlie Kirk. He said, Kirk represented exactly the kind of voice that Britain's establishment would crush if given the chance. Bold, unapologetic, yet peaceful. Kirk challenged immigration policy, gender ideology, and COVID restrictions, issues that in Britain could trigger police involvement under current hate speech laws. Robinson's chilling point was that Kirk's assassination should be seen as a warning sign of what happens when governments normalise the idea that certain political views are too dangerous to be expressed. If speech is treated as violence, then eventually someone will justify responding with real violence. The public response to Robinson's framing of the issue has been extraordinary. Conservative commentators across the West began echoing his arguments. American talk show hosts pointed out that Kirk's activism was always about debate, never about violence, and yet he was the one targeted. British commentators, meanwhile, started asking uncomfortable questions about whether Starmer's government had gone too far in restricting political speech. Even voices that typically distance themselves from Robinson admitted he had a point, that governments can't, on one hand, demonise political opponents as dangerous extremists, and on the other hand, act shocked when violence erupts against those same opponents. Starmer's office, sensing the growing storm, issued a clarification of his original statement. A spokesperson emphasised that the Prime Minister condemns all political violence, regardless of ideology, and stands firmly for democratic debate. But the clarification did little to quiet the backlash, because Robinson seized on it as proof that Starmer was feeling the pressure. He's scrambling, Robinson said. He knows people see through the act. He knows the public is starting to ask who really fuels the hatred. Meanwhile, the assassination of Kirk itself continued to dominate headlines in America. Candlelight vigils were held on college campuses where he had spoken. Turning Point USA announced a nationwide tour in Kirk's honour, promising to keep his message alive. And yet, instead of the story being framed purely as an American tragedy, it was now inseparably linked to British politics. Robinson had ensured that by dragging Starmer into the debate, he made Kirk's death not just a loss for America, but a test case for the entire Western world's handling of free speech and dissent. This shift has terrified the political establishment because it reframes the narrative. Instead of being about one gunman and one victim, it's now about whether governments themselves share blame for fostering a climate where political opponents are treated as enemies of the state. Robinson's relentless focus on this argument is what gives it power. He's not simply saying Starmer is a hypocrite. He's saying Starmer represents a system that makes violence inevitable by removing peaceful alternatives. Charlie Kirk was the peaceful option, Robinson declared in his video, and now he's gone. Do you understand what that means? The chilling undertone of that question has sparked fierce debate. Some say Robinson is warning of further radicalisation if governments continue down this path. Others accuse him of almost justifying violence by blaming governments instead of attackers. But either way, the effect is the same. Starmer is on the defensive, and Robinson has set the terms of the conversation. In politics, that's half the battle won. And here's where things escalate further. Robinson isn't standing alone. Other Conservative figures in Britain have begun to echo his criticisms, emboldened by the attention his words have received. Small activist groups are organising rallies demanding free speech protections. American Conservatives are now citing Robinson in their commentary. Commentary on Kirk's assassination. What was once the voice of a single controversial figure has begun to sound like the opening notes of a chorus, and that chorus is singing the same song. That censorship, hypocrisy, and double standards are pushing the West to the brink. This is no longer just a political spat between a prime minister and a dissident. It's rapidly becoming a movement, one that is gaining traction on both sides of the Atlantic. And as it grows, the pressure on Starmer intensifies. Because if Robinson is right, if Kirk's assassination is a symptom of something deeper, then this isn't just about one tragedy. It's about the future of political freedom in the West. As Robinson's words ricocheted across the digital world, the political temperature in Britain began to rise in ways Starmer could no longer control. Parliamentarians were forced into awkward positions. Journalists pressed Labour officials with questions they weren't prepared to answer, and opposition figures smelled blood in the water. For the first time since becoming Prime Minister, Keir Starmer wasn't simply managing a scandal. He was on the defensive against an international firestorm that exposed the very foundations of his political project. And at the centre of it all stood Tommy Robinson, a man long dismissed by the establishment as an outsider, suddenly commanding global attention. The heart of Robinson's third wave of attacks wasn't just about exposing hypocrisy, it was about warning of the dangers Britain now faced. He argued that if Charlie Kirk could be targeted in America despite being the peaceful face of conservative youth activism, then nobody was safe in a system that criminalises speech. Do you understand? Robinson demanded in a fiery live stream. If they can paint someone like Charlie Kirk as a threat, if they can treat his ideas as dangerous, then they are telling every Conservative in Britain that you're one step away from prison or worse. This wasn't a casual remark, it was a direct appeal to ordinary citizens who had already felt the chill of government scrutiny. The chilling irony, Robinson said, is that Kirk represented exactly what governments claim to want. A man who channeled political energy into peaceful debate, lawful organisation and grassroots activism. He wasn't hiding in the shadows, he wasn't advocating violence, he wasn't radicalising young people into extremism. Quite the opposite. He was proof that young Conservatives could engage openly in the political arena without resorting to hate or violence. Yet he was the one silenced forever. Robinson's message was clear. If a figure like Charlie Kirk isn't safe, then no voice is safe. In Britain, Starmer's Labour government scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Officials reminded the public of Labour's commitment to tolerance and democracy, but the words rang hollow against Robinson's relentless barrage. Conservative MPs began seizing the moment, questioning whether the UK's hate speech laws had gone too far. Some even suggested that Robinson, though deeply controversial, was raising questions worth debating. That was a nightmare scenario for Starmer, because the last thing Labour wanted was for Robinson's message to gain legitimacy inside the halls of power. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Kirk's assassination was no longer being discussed in isolation. American commentators picked up Robinson's accusations and started pointing fingers not just at the gunman, but at the broader political culture that dehumanises conservatives. This is exactly what happens, one American talk show host said, when you label half the population as extremists and dangerous. Someone eventually decides they're doing the world a favour by pulling the trigger. Robinson's voice had crossed the ocean, amplifying a narrative that Western elites desperately wanted to suppress. And this is where the crisis deepened. Starmer suddenly found himself in a trap of his own making. If he ignored Robinson, the accusations spread unchecked. If he responded directly, he elevated Robinson to the status of a legitimate political challenger. The result was paralysis. And in politics, paralysis is deadly. Every day the headlines grew darker. Starmer under fire over Robinson's accusations. Charlie Kirk assassination sparks free speech debate in UK. Robinson's message goes global. Robinson sensed weakness and pushed harder. He reminded his followers that this wasn't the first time governments had tried to silence dissent. He listed examples: journalists dragged through courts, ordinary citizens investigated for Facebook posts, activists threatened with prison for peaceful demonstrations. They say they're protecting democracy, Robinson said, but what they're protecting is their monopoly on power. And now, he argued, that monopoly had been exposed by a single event, the death of Charlie Kirk. The danger for Starmer wasn't just the message, it was the messenger. Robinson has always thrived when painted as the underdog battling a corrupt establishment, and in this case, the establishment had handed him the perfect weapon. By offering condolences for Kirk, while enforcing laws that criminalised the very ideas Kirk stood for, Starmer had opened himself up to the charge of ultimate hypocrisy. Robinson hammered this point mercilessly, framing Starmer not just as a politician he opposed, but as a symbol of everything wrong with Western politics, leaders who preach democracy while practising suppression. As this narrative spread, the mood on Britain's streets began to shift. Small but growing demonstrations were held in London, Manchester and Birmingham. People held signs that read, "Free speech is not a crime," and "Justice for Charlie Kirk." For Starmer, this was catastrophic optics. He was supposed to be the calm, competent leader, restoring stability after years of turmoil. Yet now he was being cast as the architect of suppression linked, however indirectly, to an assassination abroad. But Robinson wasn't finished. He began teasing that he would reveal more evidence of how the government systematically targets dissent. He hinted at files, testimonies and documents that, in his words, prove beyond doubt that Britain is no longer a free country. Whether or not such evidence existed didn't matter in the moment. The mere threat kept the story alive, feeding public curiosity and ensuring Starmer couldn't escape the narrative. Tommy Robinson just went nuclear on UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's shocking assassination, and the political earthquake this has triggered is unlike anything we've seen before. A 31-year-old Conservative icon shot dead in America has now set Britain on fire because Robinson is openly accusing Starmer in his huge protest of creating the very climate that made this tragedy possible. His words are spreading like wildfire across social media, sparking a debate that cuts straight to the heart of free speech, censorship, and political violence in the West. What Robinson said has already been described as one of the most explosive challenges to a sitting UK Prime Minister in recent history, and the fallout is tearing through both nations with speed and fury. If you thought this was just another international condolence message, think again, because Robinson is turning Kirk's death into a global indictment of the political establishment, and he's naming names. The story begins with the news that stunned America and quickly reverberated across the Atlantic. Charlie Kirk, the outspoken conservative firebrand who built Turning Point USA into the largest youth political movement in America, was assassinated at just 31 years old. Within hours of the shooting, tributes and statements poured in from political leaders worldwide. Among them was UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who issued what at first appeared to be a routine political condolence message. He condemned violence, expressed sympathy for Kirk's family, and called for unity in the face of division. To most observers, it was nothing more than the standard political script. But for Tommy Robinson, Britain's most controversial activist, it was an insult wrapped in hypocrisy. Robinson's response came fast and came hard. He didn't just criticise Starmer, he launched a direct and brutal attack that immediately went viral. His message was simple: Starmer's government has spent years criminalising free speech and persecuting conservative voices, and now he dares to act shocked when a conservative leader is gunned down. Robinson accused Starmer of fuelling the very climate of hostility that makes political violence inevitable. He said, "If Charlie Kirk had lived in the UK, your government would have thrown him in prison. You put targets on people's backs with your smears, then pretend to be outraged when someone pulls the trigger. These weren't just angry words on social media, they were an accusation that the policies of Britain's ruling government are complicit in the silencing and endangerment of political dissidents. And the truth is, Robinson might have a point. Look at the record. In Britain today, ordinary citizens are arrested for social media posts critical of government immigration policies. Individuals have police records for so-called non-crime hate incidents, even when no law was broken. The broad scope of UK hate speech laws has created a two-tier justice system where political dissent is treated as a threat, while establishment-approved narratives are protected. Robinson himself has lived this reality for over a decade, cycling in and out of courtrooms and prison cells for daring to publish stories the establishment wanted buried. His entire career has been shaped by what he calls Britain's war on free speech. So when Starmer expressed sorrow at Kirk's assassination, Robinson saw not sympathy, but hypocrisy. To Robinson, Charlie Kirk represented something powerful and dangerous to the establishment. A young conservative who could challenge progressive orthodoxy without violence, without extremism, and without hatred. Someone who could win debates in the open arena of ideas. Kirk went to the most liberal campuses in America and debated hostile audiences, and he often left those audiences questioning the narratives they had always accepted. He wasn't silenced, he wasn't criminalised, and because of that, he reached millions. Robinson's argument is that in Britain, someone like Kirk wouldn't even get the chance. He'd be arrested under speech laws, smeared as an extremist, and silenced before he could ever build a movement. Robinson sensed weakness and pushed harder. He reminded his followers that this wasn't the first time governments had tried to silence dissent. He listed examples: journalists dragged through courts, ordinary citizens investigated for Facebook posts, activists threatened with prison for peaceful demonstrations. They say they're protecting democracy, Robinson said, but what they're protecting is their monopoly on power. And now he argued that monopoly had been exposed by a single event, the death of Charlie Kirk. The danger for Starmer wasn't just the message, it was the messenger. Robinson has always thrived when painted as the underdog battling a corrupt establishment, and in this case, the establishment had handed him the perfect weapon. By offering condolences for Kirk while enforcing laws that criminalised the very ideas Kirk stood for, Starmer had opened himself up to the charge of ultimate hypocrisy. Robinson hammered this point mercilessly, framing Starmer not just as a politician he opposed, but as a symbol of everything wrong with Western politics. Leaders who preach democracy while practicing suppression. As this narrative spread, the mood on Britain's streets began to shift. Small but growing demonstrations were held in London, Manchester and Birmingham. People held signs that read, "Free speech is not a crime and justice for Charlie Kirk." For Starmer, this was catastrophic optics. He was supposed to be the calm, competent leader, restoring stability after years of turmoil, yet now he was being cast as the architect of suppression, linked, however indirectly, to an assassination abroad. But Robinson wasn't finished. He began teasing that he would reveal more evidence of how the government systematically targets dissent. He hinted at files, testimonies and documents that, in his words, prove beyond doubt that Britain is no longer a free country. Whether or not such evidence existed didn't matter in the moment. The mere threat kept the story alive, feeding public curiosity and ensuring Starmer couldn't escape the narrative. The bigger picture was now unmistakable. Charlie Kirk's death had triggered a domino effect and Starmer was right in the middle of it. What should have been a moment of quiet statesmanship, issuing condolences for a foreign tragedy, had exploded into an international political war. Robinson had framed the debate, captured the headlines and shifted the conversation from a lone gunman in America to the systemic suppression of conservatives across the West. And for Starmer, there was no easy way out. The storm that began with the death of Charlie Kirk now stood at full force, and Keir Starmer was caught right in its eye. What should have been a moment of solemn condolences had spiralled into an international scandal, not because of what Starmer said, but because of what Tommy Robinson exposed. Robinson had turned a tragedy into a weapon, not by distorting the facts, but by forcing the world to look at a reality the establishment wanted to keep hidden. The reality that in modern Britain, and increasingly across the West, peaceful conservative voices are treated as enemies of the state. Robinson's relentless campaign framed Starmer as the architect of this suppression, the man whose policies had built a climate where dissent is criminalised, where debate is silenced, and where political opponents are smeared until someone somewhere decides they deserve to be eliminated. The accusations were brutal. But what made them impossible to ignore was their resonance with real events. People remembered arrests for social media posts. They remembered Robinson's own trials and prison sentences. They remembered how mainstream voices had been hounded, harassed or silenced for speaking against official narratives. Robinson's attack worked because it didn't rely on fiction. It relied on memory. And that memory was now exploding into political energy. Demonstrations grew larger. Conservative MPs started calling for reviews of free speech laws. American politicians began referencing Robinson's accusations in congressional speeches. The story had jumped the rails of partisan politics and entered something far bigger, a debate about the future of free expression in the Western world. At the centre of this debate stood two figures who could not be more different: Keir Starmer, the establishment prime minister clinging to authority, and Tommy Robinson, the outlaw activist who had hijacked the narrative and turned it against the most powerful man in Britain. But what made this crisis truly dangerous for Starmer wasn't just Robinson's words, it was the symbolism of Charlie Kirk himself. Kirk was not a violent extremist. He was not a shadowy figure plotting in secret. He was a 31-year-old who believed in winning arguments through debate, who believed in channeling energy into lawful, peaceful activism. His assassination stripped away the illusion that free societies are safe from political violence. And Robinson's argument that by silencing peaceful voices, governments create the very conditions that breed violence suddenly sounded less like conspiracy and more like truth. In his final broadside, Robinson issued a warning that shook both his supporters and his critics. If Charlie Kirk can be killed at 31 for speaking the truth, then no Conservative leader is safe. Not in America, not in Britain, not anywhere in the West. Starmer, you don't get to wash your hands of this. You built the culture that makes peaceful dissent impossible, and now you pretend to be shocked at the consequences. Number. The blood is not only on the hands of the killer, it is on the hands of every government that criminalises speech, every leader who smears their opponents, every law that tells the people truth is a crime. The words were incendiary, but they captured a growing sense of unease that millions already felt. Across the West, citizens are asking themselves, have we allowed our leaders to cross the line where democracy becomes something else? Have hate speech laws, censorship policies and disinformation boards transformed free societies into managed societies, places where dissent is tolerated only when it is harmless and crushed the moment it becomes effective? Robinson's attack on Starmer forced these questions into the mainstream, and once asked, they cannot be unasked. For Starmer, the damage is already done. No matter what he says, no matter how many times he condemns violence or defends his policies, the image has been seared into the public mind. The image of a prime minister whose hollow words of sympathy collided with the brutal reality of his government's record. For Robinson, this moment is nothing short of vindication. For years, he was mocked, prosecuted and cast out of polite society. But now, in the aftermath of Kirk's death, he has become the voice that many believe is finally telling the truth. The world now stands at a crossroads. Charlie Kirk's assassination could become a warning that silences a generation, or it could become the spark that ignites a movement determined to reclaim free speech and political freedom. Robinson is betting on the latter. Starmer is praying for the former, and the rest of us are left watching as two nations, America and Britain, find themselves bound together in a crisis that is no longer about one man's death, but about whether Western democracy itself can survive its own contradictions. Because if Robinson is right, then Charlie Kirk's assassination is not just the tragedy of a single life lost. It is the chilling preview of what happens when governments wage war on speech and when political debate is replaced with political persecution. And unless something changes, Kirk will not be the last.